In the vast expanse of Montana's wilderness, where secrets lie buried beneath decades of silence, a young cowboy's world is about to shatter. When Jake discovers a hidden truth about a mysterious ranch hand who bears an uncanny resemblance to his late father, everything he believed about his family legacy will be questioned. This is a story of blood, betrayal, and the unbreakable bonds that define us. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of the Double Bar Ranch like a ghostly veil, and 25-year-old Jake Morrison guided his horse through the familiar terrain with the practiced ease of someone born to this land. His weathered hands gripped the reins with a confidence that came from a lifetime in the saddle. But today, something felt different. The ranch had been his entire world since childhood, passed down from his grandfather to his father, and now to him after his father's tragic death in a riding accident 5 years prior. As Jake approached the main barn, he noticed a figure he'd never seen before working alongside the other ranch hands. The man was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and a way of moving that seemed almost familiar. There was something about his profile, the set of his shoulders, and the gentle way he handled the horses that made Jake's chest tighten with an inexplicable recognition. The stranger wore a faded denim shirt and well-worn boots, his dark hair peppered with gray beneath a black cowboy hat that had seen better days. "Who's the new guy?" Jake asked his foreman, old Pete, as he dismounted near the corral. Pete spat into the dust and adjusted his own hat. "Name's Thomas Mitchell. Drifted in yesterday looking for work. Says he's got experience with cattle and horses. Seemed honest enough, so I put him on temporarily." Pete's weathered face creased with curiosity. "Why? Something wrong?" Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen this man before, though he was certain they'd never met. "Nah, just curious. We don't get many drifters this time of year." But even as he spoke, Jake found himself studying Thomas from across the yard. The man moved with a purpose and skill that spoke of decades spent working ranches, and there was something in his eyes, a sadness that seemed to mirror Jake's own grief over his father's death. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jake watched Thomas from the porch of the main house. The man sat alone by the bunkhouse, staring out at the horizon with the same contemplative expression Jake had seen his father wear countless times. It was then that Jake noticed the way Thomas held his coffee cup, with both hands wrapped around it, exactly the way his father used to do on cold mornings. Over the following weeks, Jake found himself increasingly drawn to observe Thomas Mitchell. The man worked with a dedication that impressed even the most seasoned ranch hands, but it was the subtle similarities to his father that kept Jake unsettled. Thomas had the same habit of whistling softly, while working the same gentle way of talking to nervous horses, and most unnervingly, the same distinctive scar across his left knuckles that Jake remembered his father having, though his father had claimed it came from a childhood accident with barbed wire. Jake's curiosity transformed into a quiet obsession. He began finding excuses to work near Thomas, studying his mannerisms and listening to his stories. Thomas spoke little about his past, mentioning only that he'd worked ranches across Montana and Wyoming for most of his adult life. When pressed about family, his eyes would grow distant, and he'd change the subject with a skill that suggested years of practice avoiding personal questions. The resemblance became impossible to ignore when Jake's mother, Helen, came to visit the ranch for her monthly check-in. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw Thomas leading a group of horses to the far pasture, her face draining of color as if she'd seen a ghost. "Who is that man?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Thomas Mitchell, new ranch hand." "Why?" Jake watched his mother's reaction with growing alarm. Helen Morrison was not easily shaken. She de-weathered her husband's death with stoic grace and had run the ranches books with unwavering precision for decades. He looks like ... Helen's voice trailed off, and she shook her head quickly. "Never mind, it's nothing." Just reminded me of someone I used to know." But her hands trembled as she reached for her coffee cup, and Jake noticed she kept glancing toward Thomas throughout the rest of her visit. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He found himself walking to the old storage shed where his father's personal belongings had been kept since his death. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight as he searched through boxes of photographs, documents, and mementos. In one faded photograph from his father's army days, Jake found something that made his blood run cold. Standing next to his father in military fatigues was a young man who looked exactly like Thomas Mitchell, down to the same knowing smile and the scar across his knuckles. The photo was labeled on the back in his father's handwriting, "Me and Tommy, Fort Bragg, 1978. Jake's hand shook as he stared at the image. Thomas Mitchell couldn't be the same person. The timeline didn't make sense, but the resemblance was undeniable. And suddenly Jake realized he was holding evidence of a connection his family had never mentioned. The revelation drove Jake to dig deeper into his family's history, and what he discovered shattered everything he thought he knew about his father. Hidden in a box of old letters, he found correspondence between his father and someone named Thomas Morrison, the same last name, written in a handwriting that matched the scrawl he'd seen Thomas Mitchell use on ranch paperwork. The letters dated back over 30 years and spoke of a bitter falling out, family secrets, and a decision that had torn two brothers apart forever. Jake's heart pounded as he read his father's words. "Tommy, you made your choice when you walked away from this family. Don't contact us again. The ranch, the name, everything we built. It's dead to you now. I won't have Mom and Dad's memory dishonored by your presence." The letter was dated just months before Jake was born, and suddenly the pieces of a devastating family puzzle began falling into place. Thomas Mitchell wasn't just a drifter who happened to resemble his father. He was Thomas Morrison, Jake's uncle, his father's younger brother, who had been erased from family history so completely that Jake had never even known he existed. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His father had lied to him his entire life, creating a fiction that painted their family as smaller and simpler than it actually was. The next morning, Jake confronted his mother with the evidence. Helen's composure crumbled as she saw the letters and photographs spread across the kitchen table. Through tears, she revealed the truth she and Jake's father had kept buried for decades. Thomas had been involved in some kind of scandal in his youth, something that had brought shame to the Morrison family name. Jake's father, proud and unforgiving, had demanded Thomas leave and never return, even going so far as to legally forbid him from using the Morrison surname. "Your father loved his brother, but he was so stubborn, so focused on protecting the family reputation," Helen whispered. "Thomas tried to reconcile several times over the years, but your father refused every attempt. After you were born, Thomas stopped trying. We never spoke of him because it caused your father such pain." She looked toward the window where Thomas could be seen working with the horses. "I recognized him immediately, but I didn't know what to do. He's been gone from our lives for so long, and now ... double quotes. Jake felt a surge of anger toward his father's memory, mixed with a profound sadness for all the lost years. Thomas had been working on their ranch for weeks, sleeping in their bunkhouse, sharing meals with their crew, and all the while carrying the burden of his banishment alone. The man who had seemed like a stranger was actually family. The brother his father had denied. The uncle Jake had never been allowed to know. The weight of the family secret consumed Jake's thoughts as he struggled with how to approach Thomas with the truth. For days, he watched his uncle work alongside the other ranch hands, observing the quiet dignity with which Thomas carried himself despite the years of exile. There was no bitterness in Thomas's demeanor, no anger toward the ranch or the Morrison name that had been stripped from him. Instead, there was a gentle sadness and a love for the land that mirrored Jake's own deep connection to the place. Jake began testing the waters, sharing stories about his father during their work breaks. Thomas's reactions were telling. a flash of pain in his eyes when Jake mentioned his father's stubbornness, a knowing smile when Jake described his father as habit of talking to the horses, as if they were old friends, and a visible struggle to maintain his composure when Jake spoke about his father's death and the loneliness that had followed. "Your father sounds like he was a good man," Thomas said quietly one evening as they mended fence line together. "Must have been hard, losing him so young." There was something in his voice that suggested he too had mourned the loss, despite their estrangement. "He was complicated," Jake replied carefully. "Proud, maybe to a fault. Sometimes I wonder if he kept secrets that might have been better shared." He watched Thomas's reaction, seeing the older man's hands still their work for just a moment. "Most men carry burdens they think others alone to bear," Thomas replied after a long pause. "Sometimes the weight of protecting others becomes heavier than the secret itself." His words carried the wisdom of someone who had lived with profound regret. The emotional toll of maintaining his pretense began wearing on Jake. He found himself lying awake at night, imagining all the conversations his father and Thomas might have had if pride hadn't stood between them. He pictured family gatherings that never happened, lessons Thomas might have taught him, and stories about his father's youth that had been lost to the silence of their feud. Jake's behavior didn't go unnoticed by the ranch hands, who began commenting on his distraction and moodiness. Old Pete pulled him aside one afternoon, his weathered face creased with concern. "Son, whatever's eating at you, it's affecting your work and your judgment. You nearly spooked that Mustang this morning because your head was somewhere else entirely." Pete's eyes, sharp despite his age, studied Jake intently. "This wouldn't have something to do with our new man, would it? I've seen you watching him like you're trying to solve some kind of puzzle." Jake considered confiding in Pete, who had been like a second father to him, but the magnitude of the family secret felt too enormous to share. Instead, he made a decision that had been building inside him since discovering the truth. He would confront Thomas directly and reveal what he knew. The alternative, continuing to live with the deception while his uncle worked unknowingly beside him, felt unbearable. The confrontation came on a crisp autumn evening when Jake found Thomas sitting alone by the creek that ran through the heart of the ranch. The setting sun cast long shadows across the water, and the peaceful scene felt like the perfect place to finally bridge the chasm that had divided their family for decades. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as he approached, carrying the box of letters and photographs that would forever change their relationship. "Mind if I sit?" Jake asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Thomas gestured to the grass beside him, his weathered face curious but welcoming. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the water flow over smooth stones worn down by countless years of persistence. "Thomas," Jake began, his voice thick with emotion, "I know who you are." He placed the box between them and watched as Thomas's face transformed from confusion to recognition to profound sorrow. "You're my father's brother. You're Thomas Morrison." The words hung in the air like gunshots, sharp and irreversible. Thomas's shoulders sagged, as if a weight he'd been carrying for decades had suddenly doubled. His eyes, which Jake now recognized as having the same deep brown color as his father's, filled with tears that he made no attempt to hide. "How long have you known?" Thomas asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of the flowing water. "A few weeks. I found Dad's letters, some old photographs. Mom confirmed it when I confronted her." Jake's own voice cracked as he continued. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you come here using a different name, pretending to be a stranger?" Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring into the creek as if it held answers to questions that had haunted him for 30 years. "Because your father made it clear I wasn't welcome in his life, and I respected that, even if it nearly killed me. When I heard about his death, double quotes." Thomas paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I needed to see this place one more time, to feel close to him somehow. I never intended to stay, never meant to cause confusion or pain. The revelation of Thomas's motivation, a brother's grief-seeking connection to a sibling who had died without reconciliation, broke something open in Jake's chest. What happened between you two? The letters mention some kind of scandal, but they don't explain what drove you apart. Thomas's story poured out like water breaking through a dam. As a young man, he had made a mistake, gotten involved with gambling, and had accumulated debts that threatened the ranch. In desperation, he had borrowed money against the family property without his father's knowledge. When the truth came out, Jake's grandfather had been furious, but it was Jake's father who had been truly unforgiving. Rather than work together to solve the problem, Jake's father had seen Thomas's actions as a betrayal of everything the Morrison name represented. I tried to make it right, worked 3 jobs to pay back every penny. But your father couldn't forgive what he saw as a stain on our family's honor. Thomas continued, his voice heavy with decades of regret. The final break came when I suggested selling part of the ranch to clear the debt quickly. Your father saw that as giving up on our legacy, and he told me if I couldn't fight for every acre, I didn't deserve the Morrison name. The truth about the family's shattered past opened a floodgate of emotion between Jake and Thomas. But it also created an opportunity for healing that neither man had dared hope for. As the days passed following their revelation by the creek, Jake began to understand that his father's rigid pride had cost them all something precious, the bonds of brotherhood, and the chance for Thomas to be part of Jake's life as he grew up. Jake made a decision that would have shocked his father, but felt absolutely right in his heart. He asked Thomas to stay permanently and help run the ranch's family, not as a hired hand. The offer came with the understanding that Thomas would reclaim his rightful surname and take his place as Jake's uncle and partner in preserving the Morrison legacy. Thomas's acceptance was wordless but profound, tears streaming down his weathered face as he embraced his nephew for the first time. The transformation in Thomas was remarkable to witness. The quiet sadness that had shadowed his every movement began lifting as he settled into his role as both family member and ranch partner. He shared stories about Jake's father's youth, painting pictures of a man who had been passionate and funny before pride and responsibility had hardened him. Through Thomas's memories, Jake gained a fuller understanding of his father, not as the stern, perfect figure he had idealized, but as a complex human being who had made difficult choices out of love and fear. Helen's reaction to the family reconciliation surprised Jake with its depth of relief. She confessed that she had regretted the brothers' estrangement for years, but had never felt it was her place to intervene. Your father carried such guilt about Thomas, she revealed. Especially in his later years, he would sometimes wonder aloud if he had been too harsh, too unforgiving. I think he wanted to reach out but didn't know how to bridge such a long silence. The ranch itself seemed to benefit from Thomas's presence in ways that went beyond his considerable skills with horses and cattle. There was a completeness to the family legacy now, a sense that the land was being tended by all the hands it was meant to have. Thomas brought innovations learned from his years of wandering, techniques picked up from ranches across the West that improved their operations and strengthened their connection to the land. As winter approached and the ranch settled into the quieter rhythms of the off-season, Jake often found himself reflecting on the strange twist of fate that had brought his uncle home. If Thomas hadn't decided to visit the ranch one last time, if Jake hadn't been curious enough to investigate the resemblance, if pride and grief hadn't finally given way to love and understanding, their family might have remained fractured forever. The story of the Morrison brothers became a powerful reminder that family bonds, even when strained to the breaking point, possess a resilience that can survive decades of silence and misunderstanding. In choosing forgiveness over pride, connection over isolation, Jake had not only healed his own heart, but had given his father's memory a chance at redemption. The ranch that had once symbolized division now stood as testament to the truth that it's never too late to come home, and that sometimes the greatest Courage lies in opening our hearts to the family we thought we had lost forever.